Hey guys, happy Thursday. Welcome to question time. Again, we get to dive in. We could do a bit of diving.
Yes.
I think, I've just lost the ability to pronounce anything on
Do you
Tuesday
even
Night Live anymore.
Do you even English?
We get the chance to dive into your questions that you guys want to know, that you guys are asking. And we've got two really good questions today that are a bit meatier. We get to give it a good chunk.
We've been talking about these questions in preparing for question time today, and we've wandered around in circles and climbed mountains and fallen down the other side and all sorts of things. So who knows what will come out.
But you guys are on the journey with us. Here
Yep.
to join the chat and find out more about these questions that people are asking.
Yeah.
So we're going to get straight into it because we reckon it might take a little bit of time with them and really trying to pull it out. So our first question is from Tash. And we brought up this idea on Tuesday night. We went through Ecclesiastes chapter 7.
Yep.
And we brought up this idea that true wisdom is unattainable. That you can never actually get it. And there's this strive for wisdom, but there's also this kind of, okay, but we can't get it. And there's a reality behind that.
Yeah.
And from that came a bit of a discussion from Tash about, well, this is real life as well. A lot of us strive towards perfection in some way. As Christians, non-Christians, just as people, we have these standards that we want to reach that sometimes we can never actually reach. And there's a tension going on. And so what do we do in that tension? So we're going to talk about that, about progress, about personal lives in a sense. How do we deal with that?
Yeah. And I wonder if you've made a really good point, that this is not a point about, particularly about being Christian, it's a point about being human and a person, because we set health goals and we set other goals.
New Year's resolutions every year.
New Year's resolutions. But we set goals for ourselves, and sometimes those goals are attainable. And so often people who talk about personal growth will say, set yourself goals that you can attain. But we also recognise that there are bigger things out there. I want to be a truly wise person. I want to be, the best physicist or the best teacher or whatever. And that feels like almost a bottomless pit, because the more we've grown in as a society, the more knowledge there is, the more there is to kind of know to encompass even an individual field of endeavour. And so it's almost impossible to be the perfect physicist or the perfect. You've got to specialise again and specialise again. And so. And there are these people we call polymaths who have this kind of amazing knowledge of all these different fields and can pull them together. But most of us can't do that. And so we all recognise that there's almost an unattainable thing out there that we'd like to get a little bit better at. And being a reasonable human being is about recognising that that thing out there is unreachable. So let me set some small personal goals.
We're constantly working towards something.
What's the next step? And I'm often saying to people, what's the next step? What's the one thing that you can do that'll make a difference to your life now? And I say that to Christian people, because that's many of the people I work with, but that's a general truth, I think, about being human. That what's just the one thing I can do next that'll be effective, that'll help, that'll help most. But that raises that bigger point, doesn't it, about for Christian people, about what we're talking about.
So maybe we should talk about actually what is that perfection that we're striving for. What actually is that goal that is unattainable for us? And
that's really important, isn't it? Because we are reaching towards something that only God can achieve. And so for Christians, we there's lots of different words we use for that. One is resurrection. The other is the kingdom of God. The other is a new creation or a renewed world. We look ahead as Christians and we see something that God has planned. God has planned a world that is perfected, that is renewed, where people will be renewed. And so we're looking ahead towards a day when God will lift us up out of the dust of death and out of the issues and problems in this world that we have, and he'll raise us to be, I don't want to say the best version of ourselves because I feel that's selfish. I want to say what he planned for us, what he has, that is his version of us, what he wants us to be. And that we call that resurrection. We call that the life of the kingdom of God. That's what we're headed towards. So that's our end point that we're heading towards, that we're looking ahead to. But the thing we know as Christians is we cannot get there. Okay? I cannot pick myself up and get myself into the kingdom of God. To becoming a Christian is actually acknowledging that I can't do it myself, that I'm worse than I think, and I can't fix it myself. Yeah. I need God's help. That's the very heart of the Christian faith, is this idea of grace, that God himself in love has won this thing for us, has done this thing for us, has achieved that. That's what Jesus dying for us and rising from the dead has done. He's actually cleaned up the mess, if you like. He's paid for the problem in his dying, and in rising he's actually embarked us, the human race, on this new life, on this idea of resurrection. He's actually we're going to be raised up in Jesus, and so God has won it for us. And so when we look ahead at that goal, we don't see it as something that I can attain, but something that I'm striving towards. Yeah.
Okay, but with that, and I think Tash had a follow-up question about, you know, do we neglect things completely? Because we do have that reality. We struggle in that, okay, I will never get that. But the striving then, how do we approach that striving?
Yeah. It's a really
Because if we're never going to get it, what does it mean for us? Well, why do we keep on striving? Yeah,
there's a couple of problems we have, isn't it? I think one problem we have is we go, I can't make it, so I'll give up. Yeah. And that's destructive. As a Christian, that's actually giving up on faith, isn't it? You're actually giving up on believing in Jesus himself if you say it's too hard, I won't even try. But that's one problem people have. They go, well, perfection's unattainable, so I'm not even going to try. I'm just going to whatever. The other problem though I think that more Christians have is that we make the mistake of seeing that life as an attainable life here and now. I can achieve perfection. I think that's particularly interesting for young people, because young people go, well, I'm here and it's not perfect, but perfection's only over here. It's not that far away, and I feel like if I work really hard, I'll get there. And I want to say that's destructive and soul-destroying, because you will never get there. Yeah. And one of the great realities of life is that we're called to grow towards something that by ourselves, in ourselves, we won't reach. But it's like saying, that is one day what I will be, and I want to look as much like that as I can now. I want to, because it is me who will be that one day, and so what I want to do is cooperate with God and get as close as I can, recognising that I'll never get there. So I think that's true, but then that raises some issues as well, doesn't it? Because I think one of the problems is we think we can get there, and that's soul destroying because we won't. And the other problem is in making progress. We're making progress, but I think the issue is the older you get, the more mature you get, the further away you realise you are. So I think, I'm young, I think I'm here and it's there, but as I get older, I'm growing, but my realisation is also growing, and I'm realising how far away I am. And you often see this with older saints, older Christians. They actually have a much more acute understanding of how weak they are and how far away they are. And so even though they've grown, and we would look at them and go, wow, they're so far ahead of me, they would go, yeah, but I'm so far away. And so we've got to be able to deal with those two things without being destroyed by them. And if you're perfectionistic, that's where you'll fall, that's where you'll fail, because you think it's attainable. It's not attainable by you, it's attainable by Jesus. And so,
See, how do we practically do that though? Because we're all going to fall into these different categories, and Paul himself in Philippians talks about pressing on towards the goal for which God has called him heavenward in Christ Jesus, but also realising he's like, I haven't attained that yet, so I've got to keep on pressing on. And so we have a call to keep on pressing on, but how do we actually deal with, I think, the reality of that tension?
Well, I think in some ways that's where Ecclesiastes might help us, this idea of balance. Because we need to strive with balance. So, we need to be able to understand that we will not be perfect, and yet strive towards it. And so not be content, but also not be, not despair. And so you need to live in that tension between contentment and despair, because contentment's wrong, isn't it? Because we know we're not there and we want to keep moving. But despair is also, we know is also, we've failed if we despair, because why should you despair? Because you're heading toward, you know, Jesus is going to take you there by grace. You know, it's not up. That's
in a sense, it's a promise that will be fulfilled. It has been fulfilled.
And so we need to strive at that balance. And I think that's what what Ecclesiastes is talking about, what the teacher's talking about when he says, don't be too righteous and don't be too wicked. He's not saying practice wickedness. I think what he's talking about here is an understanding of yourself, that that you're not content with the wickedness inside of you, but you're also not destroyed by it. You understand that God will reform you bit by bit, which is why I said, you know, pick one thing and work on it. And quite honestly, sometimes we pick that one thing and we're working on it for a very long time, and we go a bit forward and a bit backwards and a bit longer backwards and a bit forward, and so, you know, these are things we struggle with. Sometimes we feel like we've conquered something and then it comes back around and we're struggling with it again. And so I feel like that's part of the wisdom that Ecclesiastes helps us with, that we see them in the Christian life when we're trying to grow and get better, but we recognise that's a struggle. We're struggling against something that will not be fixed until the end.
Yeah. I think, so Duncan's watching, always. He's always here on Thursdays. He's brought up a good point about motivations, which I think is really interesting, because it also might just kind of bring out that self-awareness of what is actually motivating you, perhaps, to strive so hard in trying to attain that perfection now. Like, what's actually going on in your heart? Is it for something else, or is it for your selfishness? Like, how do you think motivations play in that?
So Duncan talks about doing stuff because you love Jesus and God. I want to say, Duncan, be careful with that as a motive. Be careful with thinking that that's the only motive for action, because the Bible has a range of motives for Christians to act, and one is fear. Do you not know that the people who do these things will not inherit the kingdom of God? Ephesians chapter 5. Over and over again, the Bible says, be warned. Be warned. That if you give yourself to these things, you will fall short. And so I do think you're right that love for Jesus, love for God is a clear and powerful and good motive for Christians. But there are positive and negative motives, and both of them are useful for Christians and are used by the Bible. And so I just think be careful about being narrow about it. It's not wrong to warn each other. I think it's quite appropriate, and we're going to get to this, I think, in the second question when we talk about our struggles. But I think part of the problem with this is we try to be too pure, too perfect,
too right,
and I there's a failure there, because if we say this is the only motive or this is the only way, we not only do we fail to capture the fullness of what the Bible says, but we can fall into a trap ourselves.
Yeah, definitely.
And I guess this takes us into
perfectly into our second question. So let's deal with that a little bit. So the second question has come from Andrew. He's brought up a passage specifically that we're actually going to get into to help us dive into the bigger topic, and he's asking about sin. How do we deal with sin? How do we talk about sin? What is sin really at its heart? And so he brings up Matthew chapter 18, specific verses 6 to 9. So we're going to read that out, and I think it's good and helpful for us to actually talk about this passage itself, and it will bring out the conversation quite easy. So it's basically like a little Bible study for us. Okay, so let me read Matthew chapter 18, starting at verse 6. But if anyone causes one of these little ones who believe in me to sin, it would be better for him to have a large millstone hung around his neck and to be drowned in the depths of the sea. Woe to the world because of the things that cause people to sin. Such things must come, but woe to the man through whom they come. If your hand of your foot causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to enter life maimed or crippled than to have 2 hands or 2 feet and be thrown into eternal fire. And if your eye causes you to sin, gouge it out and throw it away. It is better for you to enter life with 1 eye than to have 2 eyes and be thrown into the fire of hell.
Well, that's a bit extreme.
Yeah. Great passage for us to read today. let's talk about sin.
Yep.
It talks specifically about sin, about the seriousness of sin and how
yep.
to deal with sin, but also leading others to sin.
Yep.
So firstly, Sano, what is sin? How do we even approach sin
yep.
and the topic of this?
Yep. Okay. Right. This is a big topic, so we'll probably just touch on it really today. I want to step back actually, right, and instead of starting with sin, I want to start with something that all of us experience. See, all of us have an experience of life. Whether we're Christian, we're not Christian, doesn't matter who we are, we experience life in the world. And I think a universal experience of all human people, all people with 2 arms, 2 legs, 2 eyes, and a brain in this world, is that the world is not perfect. The world is far from perfect. In fact, we would say the world is quite bad. And the older we get and the more we know about the world, the more we see of its imperfections and its problems and the problems with people. The problem isn't just that things are bad out there in the world, like diseases or things. The problems are in the human heart. And we struggle with this. We struggle to account for it and to talk about what it is. For Christians, the word behind this is the word sin. So when Christians talk about sin, what we're talking about is we look at the world and we see there is something wrong with the world, which is a universal experience, and our accounting for it is this word sin. And so what is it about the word sin and this Christian word that explains for us or helps us to account for or make sense of why the world is so difficult and bad and why it doesn't seem to improve? The world may get better, but in terms of technology, but the human heart doesn't get better. The way we use tech is still compromised and bad. So, we had people exploit children, but now that we've got the internet, we just do it. It's exploded, child pornography and those sort of things, and we find it hard to actually deal with. So, what's accounting for this problem in the world? For Christians, it's the word sin, and sin at its heart is turning away from God. Sin isn't doing naughty things. Sin is actually saying that human beings have turned away from their Creator. That God made us, and that God is the one who knows the world. And He knows the world morally. He made us to live in the world in a certain way. And when we turned away from God, when we said to God, I don't want to listen to you anymore, I want to run my life. I want to have power over my life. I want to decide what's good for me. That is sin. And so sin has a relational dimension, a turning away from God, and it has a moral dimension. I want to decide what's good for me. And the problem is that when we decide what's good for us and we don't allow God to decide that, we decide all sorts of things. We get all the things that are in the world today. We get what we call sins. And if you like, sins or sinning is living out that rebellion against God. So the heart of sin is turning away from God and deciding, I do not want to listen to God. I want to determine life for myself. I want to be God for myself. Sins, the things that we do, come out of that. The actions that we take that come out of that. And so sins, in a sense, are not doing naughty things or breaking rules. Sins are living a life of rebellion. And that's why it looks so awful. And so that's really what we mean when we talk about sin and dealing with sin. And so for Christians, sin is bad. Just the same way that a non-Christian person might look at the world and go, there are evil things in the world or there are bad things in the world and they're bad and we need to deal with them. Well, a Christian thinks the same way. The question is about what solution you think there is. So I remember having dinner with a guy who was a sales rep, and we were talking about the world and how bad it was. And I said, well, how do you think you'd fix the problems of the world? And he straight away turned around and said, education. Education's the way to fix the world. If people are properly educated, they won't do bad things. So that's one of the so you might be someone who, believe in God, but you see the problems in the world and you go, the answer to the problems is education. If we educate people, the world will be a better place. I want to contest that. I don't think that answers the problem. I think that educated people are just educated sinners. They just do bad things still. They just do it in a more educated way. Some of the worst people in the world have been some of the brightest. But for Christians, the issue is not education. The issue is relationship with God. That our relationship with God is broken. And that's why we do these terrible things. And so we've got this issue. There are terrible things in the world. It's about sin, that relationship with God. How do we deal with that? Yeah. And that's the background to this passage.
Yeah. Explaining that.
Yep.
Okay. Kind of don't know where to take it now.
Sorry. we went down and we've now in a dead end. We've got to kind of reverse up a little bit.
No, I think it's helpful. We've got this context of what we mean when we say this word sin.
Yeah.
In the passage itself, it brings up this idea of how to deal with sin by cutting off stuff. So how about we deal with that then? Because I think that relates.
How do you deal with sin? So
how do you deal with it?
Jesus is one of those people who just he gets what it means to be human. He's trying to explore with us or teach us what it means to be human in this world and what it means to relate to the creator of the world. And so he talks about lopping your limbs off, which seems to be very strange. If your hand causes you to sin, or your foot, I'm not sure how your foot could cause you to sin, other than
steps you in the wrong direction, takes you somewhere you don't want to go.
Dancing. We all know it's about dancing.
Footloose.
So your eye causes you to sin. I think we feel like the eye, we can understand that, particularly blokes can understand that, but he says if your limbs cause you to sin, cut them off and throw them away. But what do we actually know? We know our limbs don't cause us to sin. It's not my hand that causes me to sin. It's me that uses my hand to sin. So the hand's not causing it. The hand's doing it, but it's not causing it. Yeah. And so I do evil in the world, but where does that sin come from? It comes from me. I'm not sure what you call that. Do you where does sin reside? It doesn't reside in my limbs or in my eyes or my ears. It resides in myself.
So why then does he tell us to cut off the limbs?
I think he's saying that sin is serious, that evil is serious. He's saying something that all of us agree with, right? And here's the funny thing. We look at that and we go, oh, Jesus is being ridiculous. But he's actually being incredibly, profoundly rational. We believe that there is evil, there is bad in the world, and we want to stop it. And Jesus says you've got to cut it off. But the question is, you can't cut it off by cutting off your hand or your foot. All you'll do is be a maimed sinner, won't you? You won't perfect yourself by removing your hand or your eye or your foot. You need to remove yourself. How do I remove myself? Well, it's impossible, isn't it? And I think that's in some ways what Jesus is driving at, that this is an impossibility. We can't. How do we do this? And that's because he's driving towards something else. He's driving towards the point where he cuts himself off for us. That he, in effect, doesn't just cut off his hand or his foot or gouge out his eye, he cuts off his life. Because it's yourself. It's myself that's the problem. And the only dealing with myself is to cut myself off completely, isn't it? And so Jesus is pointing towards the moment where he's going to take that for us. And so I think this passage is driving us towards a solution to the problem. That what we really need is a radical solution. And I think the problem with a lot of the non-Christian answers to evil in the world is not that they it's not that they take evil too seriously. So they don't take it seriously enough. They don't actually understand how deeply embedded it is in us. And so how impossible solutions like education are.
So if Jesus is the solution, he's died, he's risen again. We trust that and we believe that as people who believe. But we still know that sin is around. So how is it a solution if we can sit here today and say, I'm still sinful. I'm still doing the things that cause me to sin.
I think one of the great frustrations that Christians and non-Christians have with the Christian faith is it's a not yet. Like as Christians, we believe God has solved the problem, past tense, because Jesus died and rose from the dead. That's why we celebrate the death and resurrection of Jesus, because they are at the heart of resolving this issue of myself, of ourselves, of bad in the world. It's been resolved, and yet the resolution hasn't come yet. Why is there still evil in the world? Why are we still struggling with evil? We're back in the previous question.
Yeah, exactly. Where, do relate.
Why? And I think that's an immense frustration people have. Why isn't it solved? And the answer, God's answer is, because I want people to be joined to join this. I want people to see that that the solution is in Jesus and join it. I don't want people to miss out. And so there's that call It's the Christian gospel, the Christian message. We're not calling people to some kind of internal perfection. It's the mistake people often make. Oh, Christians are hypocrites. Well, I guess we are, in a sense. But we're not hypocrites because we're not claiming to be perfect. Christians are not people who claim to be perfect. They're people who claim that God is perfect and that God is the one who will perfect us. God is the one who saves us, who rescues us. We are the ones for whom Jesus died and rose from the dead. And so Christians are not perfect people and never claim to be perfect people. We claim to be people for whom God has done that. And that's what we talked about in the previous question. That is in the future. We're waiting for that resolution to happen. And as we wait, God is calling people to put their trust in Jesus, to actually join that resolution of evil and sin.
And so how do we talk about this? Because in the passage itself, it brings up woe to the person who causes someone to sin. So it actually it shows that there is a responsibility for other people, the way that they lead others to live. But also I wonder if it's, how do we as Christians talk to each other about sin that we see in each other's life? But also I wonder if there's a point that perhaps someone who's watching who isn't a Christian, but has had that experience where someone's turned around and said, you're a sinner. And they've gone, well, hang on, what about you yourself? Like, you're a hypocrite. So how do we actually talk to each other about the sin in our life?
Well, I think the first step is to step back and say, do we think that whatever we call it, evil, bad, sin, is a problem in the world? Do we think it's terrible? Do we think its consequences are terrible? Do we think the way we treat each other, the way we treat the world, the way we treat God is actually bad? And if we think that, then we need to actually take that thing seriously. And so, you don't get a cancer diagnosis and then just blasé go on with your life. You take that seriously and you endeavour to treat it. You go and try and get it cut out. You go take chemotherapy, you have radiation. You try it because you take it seriously because it's life-threatening. And that's really what I think what Jesus is talking about here in terms of sin. Sin is life-threatening. Sin cuts us off from God, because the essence of sin is cutting ourselves off from God. We've cut ourselves off from God, and that has consequences. And they're serious. And they're more serious than just simply the bad things we do. The bad things we do are bad enough, but the outcome of all that is being cut off from God forever. And that is desperately serious. And so that's why we want to deal with it. And so we want to come to Jesus and deal with that, but then we want to apply what we were talking about in the previous question and grow towards that. We want to say, well, it's not acceptable just to say it doesn't matter what I do. It matters what we do with our bodies. What we do in this world matters, and we want to get better. We're not perfect. Christians are not perfect people, but we want to strive to be better, because Jesus died and rose from the dead, and he said humanity is not meant to be about this. You were not created to be about evil, and so we ought to strive to do away with it.
And so, sorry, just to make sure that we're answering Andrew's question, how does one person talk to another person about that?
Well, let me go to another thing that Jesus says in the same book in Matthew, back in the most famous sermon Jesus ever preached, the Sermon on the Mount. And he talks here a little bit about how we ought to talk to one another about our behaviour. And I'm looking for it. Maybe it's somewhere else.
Are you thinking about Luke, perhaps?
Oh, am I?
I would.
About planks and specks?
Yeah, I think you're thinking about Luke. Oh, wow. Who would have thought
wow.
that? I would have
Caitlin,
gotten this right.
You got me.
So if you go to Luke 6 verses
Yes.
37.
Oh, Caitlin.
Bible knowledge. I read my Bible.
Smashed it. Wow.
Thankfully, I literally read this yesterday.
Seriously, yesterday?
Yep.
Okay. Judging others, And so, just briefly, Luke 6:41, he says, "Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, 'Brother, let me take the speck out of your eye,' when you yourself fail to see the plank in your own eye? You hypocrite, first take the plank out of your eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. And so what he's saying there, he's saying a few different things. He's not saying that we should never critique one another, we should never actually confront our evils, but he's saying that we ought to confront ourselves first. Yeah. That we ought to know that we are actually taking sin in our own lives seriously first. And then perhaps we will have some insight. What kind of insight does it give me that if I confront evil in me first before I talk to you about your evil? What kind of insights would that give me? Well, first I would be a lot more generous perhaps, because I would realise the struggle I have. Yeah. I would understand empathy. The struggle. There'd be some empathy and fellow feeling there. I would also see that there is evil in all of our hearts, and so I wouldn't be saying I'm better than you. I would be going, man, we're struggling with this. And so it might give me a very different perspective to deal with those things, to bring them up. I might be a lot more gentle. I might be a lot more gracious. I might recognise that I am not like the doctor trying to heal you sick person. We're both sick people, and we're trying to help each other find the doctor in a sense. And so that might give me a very different perspective. Yeah,
definitely. I think it's one thing that we always really struggle to talk about with each other. For reasons like this, because we have been burnt sometimes from experiences of people doing that, and we do need to be really careful as Christians, but also just as people who love each other, and it's about care and genuine care. Jesus cared about us, so he came from a place of genuine care. It's really hard for us to do that.
I think and there's a flip side to it as well. I think we're resentful. We're resentful of criticism, and because we're insecure, because we know we're not perfect, and that's the irony, isn't it? And so we are not open to listen to somebody who criticises us. And so it is a two-way street, and so I think that's the other thing. Dealing with myself will help me to be listening to someone who comes and critiques me, because I won't immediately think, you're a filthy hypocrite, and you should just shut up, and you've got no right to say that to me. I will think, I know that I struggle with evil, and so I can be, you're not wrong. You may not have got it all right, but you haven't got it all wrong either about me. And so that may help me to address myself. And so I think that might be the flip side here. Be someone who recognises that you will have something speck or plank size in your own eye. Recognise that we are all, in a sense, part of the problem, and that others coming to us might actually be something that helps us and helps us to grow.
Yeah, definitely. I think these questions have actually really partnered together well to actually think about, okay, we have a goal, but we are not there yet. And so we need to press on. And so what does that look like in that tension? Well, Andrew's asked that question perfectly to show us that there is a tension within ourselves and with each other, but we need to have that understanding of Tasha's question of what are we striving towards and for.
And I think if you like, the key difference here between Christians and non-Christians on this, if you like, and if I could speak to people who aren't Christian, is that as Christians we're not despairing about the outcome. That is, we know that there will always be a struggle with us, but that God has in hand the future of the world and what he wants to do. And so we don't look ahead, we won't despair about this. We won't get to our old age and realise what's happened, what's changed in the world, in balance, nothing. We will say, even though we ourselves will always struggle with evil, God has dealt with evil. And so we don't look ahead with despair, if you like. We look ahead with confidence, and we can deal with these things with that confidence. And I think it's why the Christian faith has had such a positive impact on the world. And if you look at the history of the world, you can actually see that happening. Christians have done plenty of awful things, I'm not denying that, but Christian people have actually contributed to the world in incredible ways, and you can actually see the transformation in people and in their lives because of that. That's not to say that the world will get perfect ever, but that we look ahead with more hope. Yeah,
definitely. And perhaps that's another topic for another time.
Yes.
We have talked a lot here, but thank you for just us being able to chat through those questions and really dive through some bigger things that are behind these questions. This is why we love Question Time so much. And thank you to Duncan and Marcus for jumping on and being here with us live. And perhaps if you're watching this later on, feel free to always come back with follow-up questions that we can deal with next week. But for now, that's Question Time over for another week. And we'll see you later.
Catch you next week.